All right, why don't we move on to our interview for the day? And joining us is Meagan Day from Jacobin. Meagan, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Good,
Well.
good. I'm really happy you're joining us today. Let's start off by just getting your thoughts, your reflections on what took place in Bessemer, Alabama. As our viewers know, the warehouse workers at Amazon had a union vote, and unfortunately, they didn't have enough votes to unionize. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to what you guys were saying, and I'm in complete agreement pretty much. It's not good news. It's also not entirely unpredictable news. I would recommend that viewers take a look at an essay by Chris Maizano in the newest edition of the journal Catalyst, associated with Jacobin. It's called Labor's Double Bind. And the point that Chris is making essentially is that in order to get employers like Amazon to sort of like change the balance of power so that employers like Amazon can't handily crush a union drive like this, you would need something like the PRO Act. But in order to pass something like the PRO Act, you would need a labor upsurge in order to flex its muscle, because obviously the political situation is not amenable to that right now. So hence labor's double bind. That's why we can say that it's not entirely predictable. But of course, people are down about it, and I think that's understandable. But I also agree with Nando that it's not the end. This is not like the final. This is not the final word on the question of organizing Amazon. Amazon's the white whale now. Like organizing Amazon is the most important task for labor, but it's probably not going to happen first. I mean, I think that there's a lot that labor can do in the meantime to build up its muscle and build up its capacity, and that includes not just building the labor movement itself, but also making political inroads and advances so that we can actually pass laws that make it more difficult for Amazon to wage the kind of aggressive offensive that it was able to wage. I don't know if you guys saw the New York Times changed their headline. Did you guys see this?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
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 At first it was Amazon defeated the union drive at the Alabama warehouse. That was changed. Who knows why? I mean, we can speculate, right? Maybe an Amazon PR flag called them and got mad. Maybe an editor simply wanted to reflect their own opinion of what happened. But it was changed to Amazon workers appear to defeat Amazon union drive at Alabama warehouse. And then it was changed actually after that to Amazon workers defeat. So they got rid of appear, and then they actually changed it to vote down, I think, to emphasize the sort of democratic nature of the workers' decision to reject the sort of like lifestyle choice of having a union. But you can see the sort of migration of meaning over the course of those headline changes from this giant corporate leviathan used its considerable power to crush a union drive initiated by workers, to something that sort of implies that the workers like gave two options equal consideration and sort of thought about it and then decided that unions really just weren't for them. I thought that was an interesting case study. I wrote an article, a quick blog post about it at Jacobin yesterday, which people can read if they want to see my thoughts on how this is like classic anti-union corporate PR. But yeah, to your point, I mean, we should underscore. Oh, so apparently the union does have a couple of different avenues that it can pursue to like get another election to happen. We'll see if that happens. But let's say they exhaust all of their options and nothing comes of this. I think we should be very clear about the fact that Amazon busted the union. It's not like the workers then like kind of like thought long and hard about it and in a neutral fashion decided that they didn't want a union. You guys listed all of the stuff that Amazon did to crush this union drive. It's considerable, very impressive range and intensity of tactics. So that's my 2 cents, is that we're really up against the corporate leviathan here.
Yeah, I mean, you couple Amazon's ability to crush the union with Amazon's ability to just like overturn laws in the Seattle City Council, its ability to launch a recall campaign against Kshama Sawant. I mean, it really is like, you can imagine some sort of sci-fi dystopian future in which like they own up the entire world, and that we just can't do anything about it. But I wanted to ask, because I think that in the wake of something like this in Bessemer, it is true that it is a crushing defeat. On the other hand, it is also true that we have not seen such a high-profile labor campaign like this in a long time. And it is also true that we have not seen the president of the United States weigh in even as meekly as Joe Biden did on a labor campaign in a long time, many decades. It does feel like there is some sort of difference now than, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever. And this is not just reflected in the recent events in Bessemer. It's reflected by the size of Joe Biden's stimulus package. But I get the sense that, on the one hand, we want to say like, no, nothing's different. But on the other hand, something is different. And I don't know how to like sort that out. Could you like sort that out for me a little bit?
Yeah, on the union front, I mean, there's a larger conversation to be had about the Biden administration and like what we can say has changed about American politics, which I hope we'll get into. But strictly on the union question, I don't think we should overlook the fact that Joe Biden weighed in and said that he hopes that workers there can have an election that isn't interfered with. Yeah, that's unusual. I think that probably more than anything reflects public opinion on unions, which has spiked in recent years. It's at its highest point. I've written about this a few times for Jacobin. I'll see if I can dig it up, if we could put it in the notes or something. But public support for unions has been climbing. And in fact, public support for unions was sent really through the roof by the Red for Ed teachers strike wave, because it just touched so many people. And those teachers who went out on strike in 2018 and 2019 did a really good job of connecting their own struggle for, higher pay and better working conditions to what they called students' learning conditions. The kind of slogan was our working conditions, our students' learning conditions. And they did a really good job building public support and buy-in for those strikes, and that has apparently made unions much more popular in the United States. I think coupled with a lot of other things, for example, like Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns and just the kind of presence of progressive and left-wing politicians on the political stage as well. So that is something that I think we can say is shifting. I'm not going to say that the only reason that Joe Biden said that is because he wanted to pander to people, but I think that's probably a big part of it. But it's not just unions, right? Like I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about how we should regard the rescue plan, for example. I mean, clearly something is changing, right?
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit, because what's obviously been frustrating to people paying close attention is this comparison of Joe Biden being just like FDR. This is the new FDR. What he's doing is so incredibly progressive and so pro-worker. But really what I see happening is just an infusion of proposed money as opposed to real systemic change. Can you talk about that a little bit?
That is exactly right. So first of all, infusion of proposed money is not nothing. Austerity is one of the main planks of neoliberalism. We have had, ever since the Reagan era in particular, a kind of like a bipartisan race to see who can be the most sort of crushingly austere as a sign of like maturity and pragmatism in American politics. So, that the fact that people are not only talking about, but actually implementing new policies that show an increased willingness or openness to social spending is not nothing. That's actually important and good. One thing that's been disturbing, though, is the way that people, have compared Biden to FDR, or even Lyndon B. Johnson with his Great Society initiatives, because those actually created new permanent universal social programs. In the case of FDR, some of them were not permanent, but, entrenching or changing the relationship between the state and the populace by creating new intermediaries, new programs that are set up to facilitate the transfer of public money to people, to working class people permanently in many cases. That's not what we're seeing here. And so I don't think that we should be making that comparison unless, for example, the child tax credit gets, implemented permanently, and then we can start talking about that. The other thing that I think is pretty ridiculous on the face of it is overblown claims about the sort of death of neoliberalism, the end of neoliberalism. I think that we can say that something is changing, especially on the question of social spending, without saying that neoliberalism is coming to an end. And one important point that we need to make is that austerity is only one of, you could say, like 4 main planks of neoliberalism. So the others are privatization, deregulation, and opposition to organized labor. And we're not seeing nearly as much budging on the other ones. Certainly, you see some gestures toward deregulation and an occasional like kind word about, for example, the union drive in Alabama from the Biden administration, but I don't see any movement on the question of privatization, for example. I mean, is the Biden administration really going to start talking about implementing Medicare for all and decommodifying our health insurance system? I don't think so. So I think we would be jumping the gun to conflate an increased openness to social spending with the end of neoliberalism. And if anything, we can think about this materially, and we would conclude that certain segments of capital actually want more social spending because they want workers to have more purchasing power because they're experiencing downturns themselves because of the pandemic. Obviously, some segments of capital are profiting enormously from the pandemic, but others, are struggling and they want more circulation of money so people will consume more. And so I don't think that, this is a sign. I think that the rescue plan is large. It's like, I think twice as big in like GDP terms as Obama's 2009 stimulus. And I think that we should acknowledge that. But yeah, I'm not sure that it really is a harbinger of a sea change in the question of neoliberalism and also just sort of like servility to corporations.
Yeah, for me, when I take a more holistic approach in trying to analyze where the Biden administration is, I can't help but notice the messaging regarding foreign policy, the messaging regarding countries like Bolivia and Venezuela. And so, neoliberalism essentially has led to U.S.-led coups in these types of countries with the sole intention of privatizing nationalized industries for U.S.-based multinational corporations. And so with Biden continuing with that pattern, it just really does communicate to me that there is not a shift away from neoliberalism. If anything, what we're seeing so far by taking a holistic approach with the Biden administration is just a continuation of neoliberalism with this facade of progressivism and, honestly, incredibly embarrassing punditry regarding Biden being just like FDR. It's ridiculous. But one thing I wanted to ask you about regarding the child tax credit is, I want the child tax credit to be permanent. It's going to improve the lives of so many people. I wish that it was a little more robust, so it isn't just pulling half of children out of poverty. But nonetheless, it's a good part of his proposal, and I hope it is permanent. But, one other thing that's lacking is a proposal that is a little more universal, right? Like, there are plenty of people, especially beginning with like the millennial generation, who have opted not to have children as a result of the economic pressures in society. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that the universal piece is really critical and important. So the point that I've been trying to stress is that it's true that we're seeing the dam breaking a little bit on the question of social spending. But what we're not seeing is some of the hallmarks of social democracy, which are the establishment of universal, permanent social programs, public, tax-funded social programs that are intended to enshrine certain basic, needs, certain basic necessities as social rights. So, for example, the ability to afford being able to have a family, setting up programs to enshrine that as a social right for the entire populace. And until we start seeing that kind of thing happen from the Biden administration, I don't even think that we can say that he's moving towards social democracy. And I also want to say that I want to bring us back to the several points, the planks of neoliberalism that I mentioned. One of them is austerity, like I said, and then you've got privatization, deregulation, and opposition to organized labor. Imagine if you're the capitalist class, which one of those is the easiest to sort of bend on? If you're having a crisis and if there's a pressure from the left wing and if there's some sort of class de-alignment or realignment happening and things are up in the air, which of those do you feel most comfortable yielding on? It's probably going to be austerity, because think about the implications for capital of privatization, i.e. literally taking away their right to own, productive enterprises, opposition to organized labor, so letting workers organize, and deregulation, sort of like strangling their ability to perform certain activities from the government. Clearly, social spending is going to be like the easiest one to fork over if you're in a position where you feel like you need to do that. So I guess I would be hesitant to say that we're seeing the first domino fall, which I think is what some of the breathless coverage has sort of implied. And instead, I want us to think a little bit more critically about this being a potentially savvy maneuver to kind of like rescue capital in a moment of crisis by throwing people a bone and also stimulating the economy, which of course is good for certain sectors of capital. That said, I think that maybe I'm glossing over one potential explanation, which is worth throwing into the mix, and I don't think it's entirely wrong, which is that the left-wing political insurgencies probably have had a lot to do with this. So we know that the type of austerity that was dominant all the way up to and through the 2008 financial crisis, yielding that very pitiful stimulus package from the Obama administration, it's not the same anymore. And it's not just the Biden administration. I mean, the CARES Act was, considerably bigger than the federal government's response to the 2008 financial crisis. So we know that something is changing. But yeah, I'm just not sure that we're seeing a major sea change here on the rest of neoliberalism. And I also want to emphasize your point about international policy, because if those are the four planks of neoliberalism, then the purpose is to protect them not only at home, but abroad. And so it sort of naturally entails a military program to protect corporate interests abroad as well.
Yeah. Speaking of left-wing insurgencies, you wrote a book with Micah Utrecht called Bigger Than Bernie. We have a graphic for it. It's out in paperback this week. Go get it. I want to ask, why did you decide to write that book? And what is the point that you're trying to make? I mean, of course, it's bigger than Bernie, although we love Bernie. We all love Bernie. Bernie's great. But what is the state of the American left from your point of view as someone who wrote a book about the American left today?
So to answer your first question as to why Micah and I decided to write the book, originally Micah had the idea to just write a book about Bernie, because it seemed like, aside from the ones written by Bernie, there weren't actually any. But as we were conceiving of the idea, it just seemed obvious to us that timing-wise, this book was going to come out around the time that the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign was going to be over. Obviously, I want to say that it would have been unjustifiable to throw all of our weight behind the Bernie Sanders 2020 primary campaign if it wasn't possible for him to have won the primary and then go on to win the general. So we had to hold that open as a possibility as we were writing this book. And we sort of like wove that possibility throughout the book. But I think we all know that it was like not super likely. Like, if you had to say whether he was going to be president or not going to be president when he announced that he was running for president again, I think anybody would have probably guessed that he was probably not going to be president. So we wanted to write a book that would collect some of the best ideas about how the left should operate in the post-Bernie landscape. From the left, and sort of put them in one place to get people thinking, to kind of provide like a roadmap or a guide for how the left should sort of orient and comport itself post-Bernie. And we also wanted to be able to function pretty well if it turned out that Bernie Sanders was going to actually be president, which caused us, the fact that we didn't know which one of those was going to happen really forced us to kind of boil it down to basics, like a basic set of principles for how the left should engage in politics. And these are not ideas that are unique to us. I mean, Micah and I come out of, a shared political tradition, and we're in conversation with a lot of people on the organized left. And so a lot of these ideas really kind of reflect what we think are like the best and most coherent opinions about how the left should be behaving. And then we tried to sprinkle it with real world examples from the organized left, from the organized socialist left during the Bernie era, which I guess you could say started in 2015 and ended in 2020. So we have real world examples of, left political insurgencies and socialists, making inroads into organized labor to grow it and transform it and so on. So that was the basic idea behind the book. As for the book's outlook, well, we made the argument in the book that the left is on much better footing now than it was before Bernie Sanders decided to run for president. And I think that's undeniably true even still. But of course, we had to write this incredibly long preface to the paperback edition of the book, which just came out, because the book was published in like April 2020, I believe. And obviously a lot has changed since then. You know, we sort of tried to take stock of everything from the twin public and public health and economic crises to like the George Floyd uprising to the way that the presidential election rolled out. So you can read that in the new preface. But one thing that remains unchanged is our sort of like basic contention that the left is on better footing than it was before. That is not an argument to say that the left is on the brink of victory. I've noticed in today's broadcast a sort of like a somewhat resigned tone. And I think it's like understandable. Like things are not going that great. I think we should just be honest about the fact that things are not going that great at the moment. But we have more opportunities for organization than we had before. Even if the balance of power is pretty bad, the truth is that we have, for example, a mass membership organization that is a socialist organization that is DSA, and we have, you know, public support for a minimum program that is actually consistent with socialist politics provided by the Bernie Sanders campaign, which seems to be persisting. And it's our job to sort of like help it persist. That includes things like Medicare for all, tuition-free public college and trade school, Green New Deal, and so on. And so things are looking pretty bad in some ways, but also better for the left than they did before, and certainly better than they did, you know, in the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, when McCarthyism had essentially torn the American left asunder, and, you know, labor unions had been ground down with no real hope of revitalization, and so on.
What do you make of, you know, some of the divisions that people notice on, let's say, social media or whatever among the left, right? Like there's obviously there seems to be one group that seems to be hyper focused on cults of personality or the likability of certain members of Congress. And then that leads to all sorts of divisions and factions. And how important do you think it is to try to mend those conflicts? Are they important at all?
That's a really good question. I would say that we should understand the conflicts as being symptomatic of some bad habits on the left that arguably may be somewhat endemic to the left, and the best that we can do is to suppress rather than eliminate them. So the kinds of bad habits that I'm talking about are like an emphasis on individual morality. Sometimes you see that expressed in, for example, you know, an emphasis on like ethical consumption. That's a big one on the left. Another one is like interpersonal behavior, like whether or not you're being sort of politically correct in your interpersonal behavior. So like an emphasis on like microaggressions, things like that, as sort of being the terminus point for thinking about your politics. I would group all of that under the sort of like individualized understanding of left politics. And that is something that it's hard to really scrub from the left, because the truth of the matter is that most people arrive to left politics because they experienced moral outrage, understandable moral outrage at the state of our society, and so they're bringing that with them. And so you get a lot of individual moralizing on the left. And when we're at a low point, when we don't have like a big shared struggle that we're all working on, for example, the Bernie campaign, or when it feels a little bit hopeless because we keep getting our asses kicked in one way or another, or when we're idle, when there's just doesn't seem like there's much to do, then some of the bad habits start to really rear their head. And I think that's one of them. And I think it's a thread that you can see throughout a lot of the like scuffles that are the intra-left scuffles that are happening right now. Another bad habit on the left is a kind of, and this is constant, this is not a new phenomenon, this goes all the way back, is a kind of celebration of political marginality as being actually a sign of rectitude. So the idea being that, you know, to be unpopular is to have an unpopular but kind of extreme idea that is correct, is to demonstrate that you're really ahead of the curve. I think that's very connected to the kind of individual morality piece, but it's really common on the left. And I think that ultimately what that results in a lot of cases is a kind of like rejection of the of the mandate to engage in any kind of mass politics. It's like, I don't really care if people agree with me because I'm right. And it's something that I think we were able to suppress pretty well during the Bernie era. Because Bernie Sanders was actually making things popular. He was picking demands and articulating those demands in a way that really connected with ordinary people, and showed us how possible that was. But I think right now you're starting to see a creep back into left discourse. Of this particular bad habit, this kind of like obsession with maximal demands, and a sort of dismissal of any kind of responsibility to connect with ordinary people. That's a problem. And then there's the third really bad habit is of the left is kind of like when people are feeling hopeless, this is on a completely other side of the spectrum, the political spectrum, is a kind of like hyper pragmatism that's actually born out of like hopelessness. It's kind of like a hopelessness masquerading as a kind of like maturity, or like we're the adults in the room and we can't, that's completely ridiculous. So somewhere you want to like calibrate between the last two kind of bad habits that I said, the sort of like maximalist and like hyper minimalist approaches to like crafting demands and communicating with people our values. So basically that's a long monologue that is meant to convey to you that I think that there are some problems that are kind of endemic to the left and have always been there, and they're cultural problems on the left. And we whipped ourselves into pretty good shape during the Bernie era, and I think it remains to be seen whether or not we'll stay in good shape. But I think we have a decent shot. I don't think we should freak out just because the left is doing what the left often does. On social media, obviously exacerbates it. I do think that we actually have like spaces where people are more serious and are approaching each other in more good faith than ever before. And we should just like invest in building and expanding those spaces.
Yeah, I always, whenever there's like, someone's decrying the modern social media factionalism of the left, I always think about like the Spanish Civil War and like the insane factionalism that existed in the middle of, while the bombs are falling and they're still like arguing over, whatever. But you mentioned the Bernie campaign and how it served as a sort of unifying principle. And for many of us, it was so invigorating because it finally felt like we had a political home. We'd never really felt at home at the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is absolutely hostile to us. The Bernie campaign was kind of this independent organization, for lack of a better term, that served as a vehicle for our political activity and our political imagination and our political kind of hopes and dreams. But the Bernie campaign is no more. Bernie himself is still active, and he's involved in making the stimulus package better than it would have been had he not been there and things like that. So he's still active, but there is no more Bernie campaign. What do you think going forward, those of us on the left have to do with regards to our political engagement, especially vis-a-vis the Democratic Party, kind of our, the thing that we got to deal with in some way, but is also just openly hostile to us?
Yeah, I think that you really touched on something important. This is something that we say in the preface to the paperback edition that just came out. It was an idea that we had toyed with at the time, but it became very clear in the aftermath of the Bernie campaign in 2020, is that the campaign was actually, and I think in 2020 more so than in 2016, was actually serving in some ways the function in an ad hoc manner of an independent political party. So what I mean by that is that historically speaking, socialists have found two institutions to be critical for advancing socialist struggle and working class struggle. And those are the union, which we've discussed a lot, which you guys discussed a lot on this broadcast already, and then the party that exists to advance the interests of the working class contra the interests of the capitalist class, and is not a sort of like class conciliatory party, right? That's not trying to triangulate between those two things like the Democratic Party does. So we don't have an independent working class party in the United States, which has made everything very difficult for us. It makes it very difficult for us to advance our politics, because often we have to do so through the apparatus of a party that is actually saying the opposite. Other elements of it of this like giant, behemoth are actually saying the opposite thing, and in many cases trying to crush us, grind us down, and eliminate us from the political sphere. But the Bernie Sanders campaign kind of showed us a little bit what it would be like, to some extent, to have an independent political party. And what I mean by that is that if you look at what the purpose of an independent political party would be, it would be to, develop a distinct platform and agenda, one that is ambitious enough to raise people's expectations, but also achievable enough to make them feel like change is actually possible. Bernie Sanders campaign did that. A political formation that was very distinct from and could go toe to toe with other political formations. Well, the Bernie Sanders campaign was besieged from all sides, and it was like obviously a thing unto itself, and gave us an opportunity to like sort of identify our people and identify the other people, and that's kind of what the purpose of a political party would be as well. And then there's another element to this, which is that an independent political party of the working class, or a socialist political party, would activate supporters and give them the opportunity to develop skills, to develop into leaders, and would actually also create organization. Through the actual campaigning, you'd create durable organization. And I think the Sanders campaign showed us what that might look like to some extent. And then also to unite disparate elements of the left, within reason, right? But to unite people who don't see eye to eye on every single issue that pertains to left politics. I think the Sanders campaign literally did all four of those. And those are some of the main functions of a political party. So it sort of felt like we had a political party for a brief moment in time. And then, of course, bam, it's over. And rude awakening, we actually don't have any such thing. And it would have been very nice to have a party of our own that throughout the pandemic, can you imagine? Not to mention to have a party that was explicitly dedicated to advancing the agenda of, divest, invest, the sort of demands that were coming out of the George Floyd uprising, to sort of like build up the social welfare state instead of the carceral state. And then we didn't have a party going into the rest of 2020, which was a historic and completely insane year. And that felt really bad. And I think that's partly why people are feeling very demoralized. It's because we saw a glimpse into a possible future, and then it was revealed to be a mirage, and it kind of evaporated. But I hope that if people can actually, if they agree with what I'm saying, if you agree with what I'm saying, then it'll help you feel less bad, because the truth of the matter is that we never had that to begin with. That was just a taste of what could be if we actually start to put in some elbow grease and like really organize toward some kind of independent political formation if it's possible. And I'm not saying that we should start an independent party tomorrow, because actually I think that's completely impossible. And I think that we should move toward our own kind of like political body in a way that doesn't relegate us to immediate obscurity and marginality in view of the like incredibly repressive laws that we have around parties in the United States. But I do think that it's the goal. I think that historically socialist movements have found over and over again that parties are very critically important for good reason.